First of all, can you tell us who are you, what do you do, and where do you work?
All right. Well, my name is Billy Thompson, and I'm currently a DevOps and platform engineering specialist as part of the cloud CTO team, which just means if that's where the conversation is going, if that's what the customer is doing when that particular team touches that engagement, then that's the time to bring me in. And I currently work for Akamai just in their cloud computing pillar. And that comes from the acquisition of Linode.
Now, what are three emerging Kubernetes tools that you're keeping an eye on?
Crossplane. I remember when a lot of people trying to use it in production were not so happy with it. And that's really been taking a turn for the better, as we're starting to see some very big enterprises very much rely on it. It was, people working for universities and with other large networks that were actually the ones that said, I really want to use your Kubernetes product, but I need you to be a crossplane provider. So that's one that's, I think, will continue to be a rising star. Another emerging one, I'm not the biggest fan necessarily of Backstage, but the way that it has sort of just exploded and the amount of love that it gets for what it is, I think is very interesting, and how they love it, right? And the use of it and a lot of the frustrations that people run into with it are very real, especially trying to scale. But the fact that you have a community of developers that love it to the point that we're not letting go of it and we just want to keep finding ways to use it and make it better is just such an interesting story to me, because it also just kind of reflects on the story of Kubernetes in general. This thing that just came rolling out, it was the hot topic, and in a lot of cases it was kind of shoved down our throats as the next thing to use. It was difficult for a lot of people, but we loved it because it stitched together things in a certain way that filled a hole that was there otherwise. So it's interesting to see the progression of Backstage, depending on how much I personally use it or not, but it's something that I'm following along with. And then the other thing that I'm really just ever more curious about now is looking at Flatcar. And I like, the container Linux kind of coming back. Of course, there was CoreOS in the early days, but that is something that I think we'll see expansion on, in addition to use of the other Kubernetes-based hardened distributions, things like Talos and all of that. And then I'm a fan of Longhorn, specifically because of the ease that it brings with read-write many. But in my personal experience, I haven't seen how it holds up under big load and at scale. So it's kind of one of those things I personally kind of want to poke at and see where the limits are. And it's something that I may find myself wanting to contribute to, given the opportunity.
Speaking of which, gets us to our first question from one of our podcasts. On the subject of learning by doing, our guest Matthias suggests that the best way to learn Kubernetes is by doing and getting your hands dirty. Then he built his own bare metal Kubernetes cluster in his spare time. What's your strategy for learning new Kubernetes tools and features?
Definitely learning by doing, because for me personally, following a tutorial where everything just works if you follow the steps, it just doesn't absorb as well. I'm just not as spongy to that. So definitely learning by doing, actually getting your hands on it. But I'll say even better than that is learning by fixing, right? Create a fire that you can put out. If it works, that's fantastic. Break it and fix it from being broken, because when you're having to do that, when you're having to problem solve like that, you are neurologically speaking, using a lot more parts of your brain. You're using your problem solving, you're using your creativity, you're getting activation at your award centers. And those are the lessons that you never forget because of the steps that you had to take to troubleshoot a problem, the solutions, the answers that you had to go search for, the documentation that you had to comb through, painfully or not, and having to piece together that experimentation and then the joy of getting to the other side. That's, for me, the best learning you can do. It's sure the sort of jump in the shark tank to learn to swim approach sometimes, but it's worth its weight in gold. It's worth your weight in gold if it's something that you can embrace. Troubleshooting is a blessing because we learn from it. Unfortunately, there are some situations in production where that's the last thing we care about. We just want to get something working. But if you're just talking about learning something for the sake of learning it, to become more familiar with it, break it or have somebody else break it and learn to fix it.
On the subject of troubleshooting tips and the learning path, our guest Alex spent several weeks troubleshooting an issue with Kubernetes, which required the team to explore the kernel code. He stressed the importance of learning while troubleshooting. Is there any practical advice that you've learned during the years regarding debugging?
The best advice that I give, and I can explain what works well for me and in general with teams I've worked on, but consider troubleshooting, as I previously said, to be a blessing. One of the best skills you can develop here is your troubleshooting methodology, your ability to cut a problem in half, to narrow down, to filter out the things that you can rule out, to find the needle in the haystack with documentation, to find your steps if you're using strace or other things to really track down something thorny. But whatever it is, develop that troubleshooting methodology because that puts you in such a flexible situation. When my team has been hiring before, specifically, that is a trait that we've been looking for. And we'll do things, for example, set up a lab that we broke a bunch of things ahead of time for you and not actually expecting you to pass. By all means, it's marvelous if you do. We're impressed. I'm impressed. But what we really look for is how you approached solving the problem. Because if it's very copy and paste or just looking or this is good enough, then in certain environments that are as fluid as things like, I don't know, the cloud, the whole CNCF ecosystem, there's things that are moving all around where today's best practices aren't tomorrow. That ability to hit the ground running and just come onto something new and diagnose it, I just cannot overstress the importance of that. Because the way my team typically operates is we don't know everything and we're never going to know everything and we're never going to try to know everything. But if it comes in front of us, something Kubernetes related, or maybe we're talking distributed databases, we know that we'll figure it out because we've developed that troubleshooting methodology. So just having that thought process in mind every time you come across this and what you can further develop, what works for you, think of it as just a living process and something that you are perfecting over the course of your career. Now, with that spiel out of the way, some things for me specifically that I find very helpful. If you've heard of the concept of an architecture decision log, where you're logging your different architectural decisions for software design as you go along. I find that to be very helpful when troubleshooting too. What are the troubleshooting steps I took? And in the moment, you're not going to stop and write a whole bunch of documentation per se, but just a quick note could just be a simple txt file. If your research is leading you to a blog post that somebody wrote on dev.to, and even if it wasn't exactly helpful, but you actually just sort of learned a couple things and, oh, that's interesting, include the link there, come back to it later. But keeping a record of the troubleshooting steps you took so that not only one, you can reevaluate your own process of, okay, I've ruled this out and here's why I ruled this out. But then so you can go back over it later and document that further. So you have it in your KB, so you have it in your tool chest to pull out later should such an issue occur again. And then if you really, really want to learn the most in that debugging process, write it in a way as if you are the teacher who's teaching it to someone else. This is kind of like when you're writing some custom code for something internal, and then you think, oh, wait, but if I were to open source this, how understandable and readable would this be? And whether you do or not, just approaching it with that methodology, you will typically end up with better, cleaner, more readable code. So think about the same thing for the way you document this afterwards, and think about it as something that just helps yourself. So for me personally, I like to keep this decision log in my troubleshooting steps and go back and add to my own personal documentation later. And if I can find some time to write about it, that's a debugging process you learned from, you never forget, and you taught your peers in your community around you. Another common step I take is always just how can I cut the problem in half the best I can? It's not always DNS. So if you've determined that, it's probably time to move on from that after a while. But yeah, that's really it. Just you keep trying to narrow it down and keep trying things that work. Oh, and how easily can you replicate the problem? And this is a big one, especially back in the days when I used to work in customer support and we would just be over the phone with very minimal information, screaming customer and trying to help people run commands in a terminal over the phone. Any chance I could get to replicate the exact problem they're seeing, the difference was night and day. So if you can get to the point that caused the problem, you have a better understanding. But even so, just provisioning an environment to which you can test your theories or solutions to that problem. If I have a Kubernetes cluster and I have Prometheus stack, and let's say I have the Cassandra operator and I'm using OTel, I got Knative, I've got so much going on, and I'm troubleshooting and I'm getting really far this direction, and I'm like, wait a minute, I need to walk backwards now. I think that is causing more problems. Okay, so now I have to step back and go this way and then go this way, and then if you get to it, okay, how can I undo some of this? That's just a really, really bad place to be. So what I found is, as much as I can, to stop if it's been taking, I don't know, more than half hour, an hour. Okay, can I put together some OpenTofu, some Terraform, some Ansible, some Pulumi, whatever you want to use, an easy way to just quickly spin up and tear down this environment, an easy way to replicate some pristine state, either with the problem or before it, that I can go through and test away at my different theories and not have to go through this walking backwards process and the thing that's actually broken. Spending some time, even if that itself takes the next 3 hours, but if that helps you solve the solution 3 hours later, that's a lot better than a week and a half later, and a lot better than getting in a messier situation than when you started.
On the subject of using boring, simple tech, our guest Martin Clausen prefers using fewer abstractions in his Kubernetes cluster to limit the tool's cognitive load. Despite his effort, he and his team hit a somewhat unusual incident with pod topology spread constraints. What's your approach to installing and maintaining tools in your Kubernetes cluster? Strict diet or all you can eat?
My default there is going to be strict diet because, especially with all the moving parts of Kubernetes, the all you can eat approach is really just not the best one you can take, in my opinion. But strict diet also because stability here matters and the basics matter. Because if you can't master the basics, you can't master the hard stuff either. And the reality is that most of your cloud-based workloads, they're using some basics, right? At a very skeletal level, these are VMs, compute instances, right? Some storage, a networking overlay. Provision a Kubernetes cluster. Okay, some of the first things I'll need are the basics, right? Cert manager, external DNS, Prometheus stack. Okay, I have kube state metrics, I have monitoring. Cool, this is working. My ingress is working. Now I'll proceed to add something like Argo CD and work towards my GitOps strategy. But keeping it simple and mastering those basics is stability. And some of the most successful companies that I have had the privilege of working with throughout my career that have built some incredibly innovative things that fill the term deep tech, and it means different things to some people, but it's some absolutely incredible things, from distribution to state management to edge computing and so on. Some incredible infrastructure, incredible products that have been built, and you look at what they're doing under the hood with all of it, and they're sticking to the basics as much as they possibly can. It reduces your technical debt. It reduces the amount that you have to keep track of. And that actually has enabled them to foster more innovation because it gives them room to experiment. It gives them safety to experiment. Because you have a stable base, you can iterate, you can try new things, you can add on. If you're doing well and it's growing and you're expanding and expanding, it's going to get more and more complex over time. But that shouldn't be a burden to you. That should be, we had a very simple progression forward to this point, and we understand it. We know that these gears turn, and we know why. And that really comes down to keeping that diet as strict as possible. A big, I'd say, pitfall that I've seen that, and unfortunately I will probably continue to see, is companies just taking on way too much, way too quickly because something is a hot trend. Here's a good example. Multi-cloud. Ooh, what a juicy fruit that one is. But the reality is that jumping right into that, and especially if you are trying to utilize a lot of special sauce with certain cloud providers rather than sticking to core cloud infrastructure primitives, which is a simple way to go. That's a mastering the basics philosophy again. Just trying to expand in this, there's a reason there's so many companies that have been talking about doing it for years and still haven't had a successful landing with it. Start small and inch forward. It's no different than if you're trying to decompose a monolithic application. Throw everything into microservices, add in as many abstractions. Do it simple. Chop it up into a few, expand on it from there. It really, really, really is in everyone's benefit, especially yours, to iterate something in a way that is digestible and enable yourself to expand further, enable yourself to explore, and that all comes down to keeping it simple. Going overly complex is always going to hurt, almost all the time. You can say this with platform engineering as well. Companies can spend years still trying to get this down, still struggling to do it, versus how can you just really make this more basic, golden path templates, things that work really well, and grow it from there. I am exploring a lot of Pulumi lately. I've really become a fan of that because it's one of those things where the way I explore new technologies or trends are one of two ways. One, it just comes walking in the door, ends up in front of me. Maybe it's an internal project or a client engagement. Or the other way is I just find something that looks cool and I got to go try some more of it because I'm, for better or worse, a nerd. This is actually just what I do in my free time. I'm not all that interesting of a person otherwise. So yeah, in my free time, I'll get intrigued by something like, okay, I was exploring open tofu because I feel more politically aligned with that than the direction that Terraform went. So I'm looking at that and then, but then Pulumi kind of sits over here in its own little unique corner where it offers this flexibility of using your programming language of choice. That sounds cool. I just want to toy around with it. And then I get started poking with it, and then some of the real benefits really shine to me, like, this is interesting. My same test-driven development methodology, but for infrastructure. That's cool. That's flexible. I like that. And so that's something that I've really been expanding on lately. And then the other thing coming up for me is I really want to explore more distributed state, because one of the things I've heard many times over the years at various conferences, as well as client engagements and meetups and so on, are the easier ways to distribute state. When we're talking about your data store, and this could be in Kubernetes environment, multi-region clusters, this could be just very advanced distributed databases. One I'm particularly interested in trying, although I really can't because all the features are gated behind commercial licenses and subscriptions, is, for example, Apache Aerospike. But what can be done, again, simple, reducing technical debt. What is the simplest path forward, pure open source, cloud infrastructure primitives to maintain consistent state in a geographically distributed environment? And there's all kinds of different possibilities here. We can pull in NATS, we can pull in Cassandra, and that's an entire course in its own that I think I'm looking to tackle and build out and produce sometime over the next year, because it's a topic I don't think will go dry anytime too soon.
If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Typically just LinkedIn. I'm not on social media. I just never, I guess LinkedIn qualifies as social media, but that's the only place that I tend to find myself. Never had a Twitter. Interestingly, I never had a Facebook either, because I had a MySpace way back when that was a thing, and when it stopped being a thing, I just wasn't really in front of computers at that point in my life. So the social media just hasn't really taken over, I guess, except for LinkedIn. I'm on there quite often. That's probably the best way to reach me for something.